So, hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report. It is September. We missed last week because of a little bit of a scheduling conflict, but no, nothing serious. Don't worry, we haven't discontinued the show or anything. Quite the contrary, we have a lot of news ahead of us, so let us not delay. And we are starting with two big news items out of Russia, and I suppose you could say Russia's sphere, which include both Belarus and Navalny. I want to start with the Navalny one because I find it a bit more interesting. So, as we reported last week, he was supposedly poisoned with, what was it, Novichok or some other chemical nerve agent. He was allowed by the Russian authorities to travel to a German hospital, in which, of course, they confirmed the narrative. Who would have thought that would have happened? And, of course, this is what the second person in the span of less than 5 years to survive. No, third person if you count Skripal's daughter, because she was also allegedly poisoned. Uh, so, third person in less than 5 years who has survived just by the skin of their teeth this horrible nerve agent attack. I don't know how they do it. The KGB just must be getting really sloppy. Just not quality work. I'm sure Putler had them personally fed to the wolves, but with with in all seriousness, of course, a lot of us knew that this was the case, and the new outrage about this is Germany has to, the West has to retaliate against Russia in some fashion. And this is where it comes to Germany, where Navalny was sent to for quote unquote medical treatment. Now, for those of you longtime viewers of the show, and for those of you new viewers of the show, if you found this, you probably know about something called Nord Stream 2. Now, for those of you who don't, it's a little pipeline, little, that would be a massive energy deal with Russia and several countries in Northern Europe, mainly Germany. Those are the main two they always talk about. And it's been under intense pressure since I would say uh, end of last year, where Pompeo comes out saying Russia's influence must be curbed. We can't have them holding energy in like holding Europe in an energy stranglehold. We have to sanction the project and Crimea, all the regular talking points they hit with this. So that's where they're really going with this now. And we've said it a few times, but it looks like the German government might actually be willing to buckle this time because it seemed like they've been willing to before, but they always back away from that and continue on with the Nord Stream 2 project being part of that. And this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I know that you think it is, and I'll let you make that case.
Yeah, so I think the pressure is mounting. One of the signs that you often see. This is no guarantee that Merkel will drop this, but one of the signs that you normally see is the amount of newspapers that, all in coordination with similar headlines, jump on the topic. And wouldn't you know it, all of them suddenly, now that Navalny is recovering, are all talking about Nord Stream 2. Almost like Navalny and Nord Stream 2 are really deeply interconnected. Um, my takeaway, of course, is that this is the end of Navalny. Navalny cannot literally get poisoned again. Uh, People will begin to doubt it. This will be like the Syria gas attacks. So this is it. This is Navalny's last dance. I would not hesitate to say that not only is it his last dance politically speaking, but I would say also as a pundit on Russian television and even for use with regards to the West. Uh, Now, one of Merkel's ministers has come out and has said that there needs to be a united front from Europe against Russia. We need to introduce more sanctions. There was another minister from Bavaria who echoed those positions as well. Um, the first one I mentioned, I forget his name, but he's high ranking in her cabinet, and he has alluded to dropping the pipeline. A finance minister, has come out and said that there's already too much money that has been put into the pipeline, and that he doesn't. He's asking plainly. Germany's dependence on coal, which is the largest one in Europe and one of the largest of any developed European, not just European, but any developed country makes the case for Nord Stream 2. Now, of course, Russia's had Nord Stream 1 for decades. I believe it goes well into the Soviet era. And Nord Stream 2, of course, was created in order to bypass Ukraine. And because Ukraine, of course, even long before Maidan, was siphoning off the oil, the gas, and keeping a certain amount for itself, reselling it, and
Stripping the copper
and
wire from the pipes.
yeah, and they've been doing that for a very, very long time, even though Russia always had special deals with them, as they do with Belarus. So it's going to be interesting. I think this could be like as you said, the straw that breaks the camel's back. There's just an extreme amount of pressure. You could argue that Merkel is on her way out anyways, and at the moment, I don't know how much strong popular support there is to stop the deal. I think for pundits and people who pay very close attention to the news and who are on either side, this is a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal anyways. I just don't think typically the average American cares, not even the average Canadian. I know a lot of people simply don't care. Um, Macron, who's everywhere, I guess we'll get to him later on, but Macron has come out and said that Nord Stream 2 must not play a strong influence on Germany vis-a-vis Russia. So he's worded it very carefully, not to say that he wants Nord Stream 2 dropped, but he wants measures to stop Russian influence on Europe. And you have to ask yourself, what is this Russian influence? There is no Russian influence. The Russian influence on
It is
Europe and
clearly
Britain.
the migrant crisis which Putin caused by getting involved in Syria by defeating groups that were causing the migrant crisis. Look, don't ask me how it
Yes,
works. It's just the facts. I don't dispute that. I trust the mainstream media. I just want that on
yeah.
record.
There is no Russian influence. This is another hoax, another boogeyman. It's simply about we have to weaken and destroy Russia. We want these gas prices even cheaper. We want those gas and oil fields to be owned by our guys, not your guys. And with the Ponzi scheme going on, regardless. So, this could be it. I don't know. It's 94% complete. Uh, it, Pompeo is threatening sanctions. Uh, of course, America has been threatening sanctions for some time now, and Merkel has stuck to her guns. But the way she has come out today, and the fact that NATO is convening, it tells you there's been an uptick. This tells you that things might be going in a different direction, and that would be a shame because Germany would have less independence, and it would pay more to have less independence.
And do you know what?
Um,
Do you know what all is overarching this?
mm.
Douglas McGregor's pending nomination to the ambassador of Germany.
Oh, very interesting.
So I mean, because somebody like him is, from what I know about him, from what I've read from him, from what I've listened to him, would probably take the exact opposite and tacitly approve of Nord Stream. Probably take more of like a Macron position where like we have to worry about the so-called Russian influence. He might not even go that far, but point being is, if out of anyone who the American government would put there, he would likely be the most sympathetic to a Russian energy
Hmm.
project in Germany.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Uh, I don't know how much independence he would have. I I think this is a very, very big deal.
Oh, absolutely.
I think I think American deep state long range planning. This is all about containing Russia, and like for them, this cannot go on. And I think it was actually a cynical measure on their part to wait until billions of dollars had already been dumped and then to threaten, and not early on. I think that was intentional.
Yeah,
Um,
I have little doubt of that. And just with the way Nord Stream 2 has been, I brought the figure up, I think it was 2 weeks ago at this point, where natural gas in particular, and oil to a lesser extent, I think natural gas alone makes up only 6% of Russian exports. And I know it's far, far from majority when you consider both oil and natural gas, but it's still significantly higher than just natural gas. But
yeah.
what it would be is a symbolic victory for Russia. The fact integration with Europe. We have economic ties. We're providing them energy. They're providing us goods. The sanctions are being lifted, and they have been to some extent. For example, with Italy, with Hungary, with a few of these other countries. Even Germany was teetering on. I think they actually ended up lifting a few. I know actually ADF politicians were calling for it. But if you had all these things coming together, it gets rid of that illusion, that post 2014 illusion that Putin is this vile conqueror out to consume all of Europe, and that Russia is this pariah state for annexing Crimea. So
Oh,
I,
that comes later, not right now.
yeah, it does, but
Later.
but what I do have to say is the completion of Nord Stream 2 ultimately would be more about saying Europe, the European Union, to an extent, recognizes Russia as an equal partner and as a legitimate player on the world stage, rather than this barbaric pariah that was painted at like after immediately after the Ukraine crisis.
Right. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Primarily because, like, the only time Russia was painted that way was in the 90s, and so anytime that Russia is independent, like it simply cannot happen. Right. It has to be conquered.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. But all I'm saying is there will be some people more sympathetic to working with Russia and not viewing them as
right.
harshly.
Right. I mean, you can see like a chain of countries between Germany and Russia that are siding with basically Britain and America, but primarily America. I mean, Britain is not really a big player in this, um, but Britain would take the side of America. So that's the significance of pointing out Britain in this. And of course, I think we can't ignore how this is related to the ongoing development in Belarus. And weeks and weeks later, it looks like that America might have another Guaido on its hands. Um, a would-be leader that cannot be leader, that is living in another country, and that, I think, has angered um American elites in a great way. Uh, you could argue that maybe Nord Stream 2 is not just punishment, it might be a move to draw up a deal with the Russians, to create some kind of a transition for Belarus. Uh, that is something that I think is a possibility. Although narratively speaking, I don't see how they could do it because they've spent so much time arguing that it would create this phenomenal Russian influence. Like one pipeline, sure. Two pipelines, people will be speaking Russian by 2030. So I don't know how they're going to. I mean, not that they wouldn't try to counteract that narrative. Not that people have long term memory, anyways. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see how they can. That if that is what is happening right now, that would have to happen much later down the road. So yeah, things are up in the air. Um, of course, Lukashenko has kicked out all foreign media. It's a hilarious story. In Minsk, they have the Red Church, which is their name for the Roman Catholic Church. So some protesters and foreign media were hiding in the church, and I just saw a video of their Omon guard basically, opening up the church and kicking the people out, and they've locked the church now, so they can't do that anymore. The other thing that's happened is the Archbishop of Minsk now has, after visiting Poland and decrying Lukashenko, he was on his way back into Belarus. He was stopped and forced back into Poland. So he is locked out of the country, and so it's escalating. It's escalating. I think Lukashenko and others who do not want to see a Western takeover of Belarus, because that's what this is. This isn't really about really, fair democratic elections. There's a much bigger picture than that at play here. Uh, so I think they know where the influencers are, and who the big players are, and they're making sure that they never enter inside Belarus. And that is, I think, it's this triad, the Navalny, Belarus, and and Germany in the pipeline. That's this triad that's developed, and that's raising the stakes right now
And,
uh, to a very high degree. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see what NATO has to say about this, and why is NATO convening on this? Like, why is NATO? What does NATO have to meet about this?
yeah, that
You know?
they're drumming at this up like a crisis, as if Russia just stormed back into the Baltic states. It's that I mean that's the sort of reaction they're giving this, and again I would say it's for the sake of appearance that they're concerned about the situation to show that NATO still has some relevance on the world stage. But I do want to continue on what you were saying, and we'll get into this also when we get into some of the news about Montenegro and Serbia and that part of the world. But just in terms of election news, we're not going to cover the conventions. They've been done to death, and we sort of missed the window on that. But under a Biden presidency, expect those three things, the triad you just brought up, to get worse. Expect that to be intensified a hundredfold,
Yeah,
at least.
absolutely.
Because I hear people make the case about Biden, and I have to say there's some truth to it, and I'm sympathetic to it, that he would bring us to war in Syria, he would bring us to war in name a Middle Eastern country. But I think it's much more likely that under a Biden administration, it would be taking it back to Russia after we defeat Russia's puppet. We have to go intervene. We have to stop their influence in the Balkans. We have to stop their influence in Eastern Europe. We have to stop their influence in Germany. It's going to be a
Yeah,
campaign like that. So when I say in particular Biden's going to be hawkish, that's the part of the world I'm talking about. Look, I'm not doubting that things will escalate in the Middle East if he becomes president, but I think particularly in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, we're going to have to keep your eye on if we get him in power.
yeah. I mean, it's a different game plan that he's on, and he's kind of inherited the what would be have been the extension of Obama's game plan. Had he had another 4 years, and that is like get all the countries bordering Russia away and out of Russia's influence and reach, demonize Russia in those countries, make sure they blame Russia for everything that's not going right in their country. So yes, I agree with you. I've mentioned this, and we've both mentioned this before in the past. If Biden wins, this is where the new tension and the new conflict will be. Um, Syria, I think, and Iraq will be just allowed to languish. I don't know what Biden would do in terms of a deal with Iran. I certainly would think that Iran would court them to return to a deal that, once that Trump is out of office. So whether that comes to any fruition, whether something manifests out of that um, proposal from Iran that I think is nearly a guarantee would happen is another thing. So I think I think basically the Democrats have the narrative. They've established the narrative for 4 years that there is mysterious Russian influence. It's everywhere. It was in Brexit. It was in small town elections in Michigan. It was the
Literally every European
2016.
election where a liberal didn't win.
Yes, Putin's hand is everywhere. Putin is to wine box boomer women what I don't know. Soros is to QAnons, but the difference is Soros actually has power and Putin doesn't. They're not even remotely on the same level.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely not. Have you? has the take been made that those protests in Germany with the imperial flags and the Prussian flags are actually a Russian-backed front yet? I'm sure it has. I just haven't seen it.
I'm
But yeah,
no,
Russia's
but it's
that there's the Russian influence in Germany they were talking about. That's what Macron was concerned about.
yes, yes. Although Schiff said that. Oh yeah, I think he mentioned that there's Russian influence in the protests, in the violence in the protests.
Oh
He didn't
yes,
explain
yes.
exactly how that's happening, but Putin has his little green man influencing the protests in America. So you can't. So you know what I mean. The narrative has been established. Russia is the enemy. They've spent 4 years. They really have to defeat Trump. Trump has got to go. They have got to get in there, and they have a lot of time to make up, uh, to reverse what happened in Crimea, to maybe then later reverse what is happening in Syria, or having reversed Crimea will eventually mean that Syria will be easily taken care of, and so on. So that's really what's happening here in the broader picture. A lot of Belarusians, they might get mad if they're listening. Frankly, they're naive. If they saw, like, I don't, but I just, it's like, do they really want this for their culture? I don't know. Like, I think they don't understand they're not an independent country. I don't think they understand that. I think they understand idealistic. I think they have a sense of idealism, and idealism for small countries is like nectar. Like, well, oh yeah, well, I deserve this too. Well, why? How are you going to do that? There's no player out there that is stronger than every country on the planet to ensure that you get the kind of independence that you want. That doesn't exist. So I think they're terribly naive, and democracy is gay.
I mean, I could not have said it better myself. And one last point I'll make on this whole subject we've been talking about is you said Navalny was worthless to the West. Now, I beg to differ because I can tell you at the 2024 DNC, Navalny will be the only white man who gets a speaking slot.
Oh wow, yeah, I did not think of that. I did not think of that.
Yeah, they'll bring him out there and they'll have him, just stand at the podium, shaking, still coughing from his poisoning, and talking about how many times Putin just tried to have him eliminated for no reason. Now that he's safe in the West, he can truly explore his bisexuality. That's gonna be the future, and you're looking at it. You may not like it, but that's just the way it is. Now, moving on to the other big news. I mean, I suppose we got a lot of big news items this week. So let's say one of many other big news items: the Balkans, particularly Montenegro. Now, there was an
Mhm.
election in Montenegro that deposed the longtime president, the guy who is in charge of Montenegro, before they even separate from Serbia. I believe you're probably gonna have to correct my pronunciation, but I'm going to try my best. Milo Druganovic.
I think it's Drujanovic. Mm, I
Okay.
have to see his name.
Uh,
Just spell it for me?
I don't know the spelling off the top of my head.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I think it is through Janovic. Like it's got like that ZH in there, I think. But
Yes.
again, we're getting caught up on. Let's just call him Milo for short. And he had been in charge of Montenegro for, like I said, the past 30 years before they were even separated from Serbia. He was actually put there as sort of regional governor by Milosevic, and from that point forward, he did almost the Lukashenko thing, almost the Erdogan thing, where he would flip flop. He's pro Serbian, he's pro EU, he's pro West. Montenegro's going to join NATO, but we're still part of the South Slav Brotherhood. So darting all over the place like that. But the more recent events that really gained the ire of the Montenegrin population was had to do with the status of several medieval churches and monasteries that belonged to the Serbian Orthodox Church. And the Montenegrin government claims is, can you provide documentation that these buildings built in the 1300s belong to you? Well, if not, they're ours now. That was their entire basis. And really trying to separate the claim of oh, well, look, Montenegrin's its own language, it's its own people, when something like one third of the country identifies as Serbian, and to the point where even the premise of Montenegrin independence didn't even assert that, and he just really overplayed his hands. He was getting that attention from the West he wanted. He was getting that money from the West he wanted, and he had been there for, like I said, 3 decades, and he actually got voted out. His party lost out, and now will I this election was, I believe, on Sunday, so less than a week ago. So I don't know if he has like stuck to his guns and like tried to contest the election or disputed the results or anything like that, or whether he is packing his bags and leaving right now. I haven't heard much news of Montenegro other than that, but I mean, this all ties in because during the protest and riots in Montenegro, of course, Serbia, they had several demonstrations in support. They had several demonstrations relating to COVID restrictions and other problems in Serbia. For example, Vucic was very unpopular, still is very unpopular. Sort of did the same flip flopping thing where he's pro Russia, he's pro West, he's pro EU. He's he wants to retract from the EU. He wants to stay as an independent country. Blah, like all these different positions just darting around day to day. And there has been, I would say, at least a moment of celebration. It looks like something of a victory may have been achieved, but I still think it's too soon to speak because, like I said, I would be surprised if he doesn't try to contest the election results or do something else to say, I actually won the election, you're wrong, and I'm staying in power.
Yeah, this can still reverse the other way, and I think we cannot count we cannot count out how the West will react to this, because it is, make no doubt about it. This is a victory, and it will be viewed as a victory for Serbia. It will be also viewed as a victory for, let's say, conservative or traditional forces that Brussels and Washington worry about developing even in countries like Hungary and Poland. And let's not also forget that this was a very small movement initially. I remember seeing photos of, no more than 100 people marching, but they persisted, and the marches became bigger and bigger. And thankfully, there was an election that coincided, because this could have turned really bad. If the election had been 2 years, we don't know if they would have had the endurance to push with the protests for that long. You know, that's the way things turn out in politics and in culture. So
Well,
things were
I
lined
actually
up,
don't
and
know in this case. I know it's a parliamentary system because he was prime minister, but was there a vote of no confidence that led to this election? I don't know, or whether it was just a regularly scheduled election.
I could be wrong. I thought this was a regular scheduled election.
I don't know either way. But that's why I was asking
No,
you. So if anyone in the audience knows, please let me know.
right. And now I did hear something. Okay, I forget his name. The opposition, the guy in the opposition. Uh, he just, he's not necessarily on the side of the protesters. So you actually might be right. I'm just not sure. I've been focusing so much on Belarus and Navalny and all that I mean, I know the bare minimum of what has happened, and I know tangentially how it's going to affect the region and Europe, but and to say nothing of how elated Serbians are, but and I'm very happy for them. But myself, I cannot remember the exact nature of the election.
But either way, the point is there was an election under, you know, whatever circumstances, and it looks like Druzanovic has lost. Now, like I said, I don't expect him to go easily unless he's just going to pick up and bail from the country, which a lot of these do. I think actually the prime minister of your homeland of Macedonia is currently in exile in Hungary at the behest of Orban, no less. So that's an interesting
Hi,
one.
hello, base department.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure the
not that he's really based.
yeah, I mean compared to the people who overthrew him, I'd say he was, but again, that's Balkan politics for you. It's it's sort of who's the less clownish one? Who represents my views better in this very vague sense? But I suppose the politics anywhere, but it seems especially accented in this certain southeastern European peninsula for whatever reason that may be.
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, it's going to be a challenge because it's going to bolster Serbia, and it's going to bolster a kind of sentiment within Montenegro and with Serbia that I think will mean using Montenegro as a weapon against Serbia will be more difficult. And a lot of Russians vacation in Montenegro, and Montenegro was one of those areas, or a certain portion of it, that the Turks never took over, and that was largely due to Russian sacrifice. Um, and it's something that Serbs remember, I think, better than most Montenegrins.
Yeah, I would say so. And like I said, that's not to mention that like a third of Montenegrins consider themselves Serbs, and this is all on top of the now stalled out but previously moving along negotiations between Kosovo and Serbia, whether that was mediated between the United States or various other outside powers. But I mean, it was interesting because Trump is looking for a diplomatic victory, and he decided, well, you know what? I couldn't solve Israel Palestine, so I sort of acquiesced to the Israelis. I couldn't solve the Korea crisis, so I sort of left that alone. It looks like he picked the third most contentious border dispute in the world, at least by my estimation, and said, you know what? I'm gonna solve this crisis, and those did stall out in the it was either the president or prime minister of Kosovo, whichever one was like the very. I think actually the more moderate
Okay.
one was brought up on war crimes charges by the Hague and everything at the behest of the
Yeah.
European Union, because the European Union, Merkel, Germany, they aren't comfortable with redrawing of lines in the, of course, Balkans. They do want a bit of instability there. Not that I think Trump really has the best interest of the region in mind and wants this great stability and prosperity, but wants ultimately political victory. But at the end of the day, I take that over the intentional instability. And the main contention of the European Union, of Brussels, of Berlin, was we don't want to be drawing borders on ethnic lines. Look at what that's led to in the past. Look at the 1990s, and of course, look at the 1930s. Look at what the one German man did then, and of course, they go on with that narrative ad nauseum.
Right.
It gets exhausting. But point being is, despite a lot of things going wrong for them in the past 2 decades, just those couple series of events, I'm not saying this is going to lead to a, rebirth of Yugoslavia or a Serbian dominated Balkans, but just those two events with a relative victory in Montenegro and some solution in sight to the Kosovo crisis, or at least a tentative solution, I could see why Serbs might feel pretty emboldened right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just more joyous than. Yes, I mean, maybe there's some measure of emboldenment, but I think it's a kind of a relief, and it's a joy out of some small victories. The plain facts on the ground, though, are that there's simply not enough Serbians in Kosovo for Serbia to take back Kosovo.
Yeah, and
I mean, I know how it happened. I was a child, a very young child, when that process was going on in Yugoslavia. But the truth is, that's where we are right now. And as unfair as how that demographic shift happened, and the expulsions of Serbs from there, and that whole process that went on even before the wars. Um, there just isn't enough Serbs there,
oh
and
yeah,
I don't know what kind of it would take some kind of an all-out war, and it would be on a scale of the '90s easily.
Well, the deal that Trump had proposed, or at least the United States proposed, I think that was actually Grinnell, who's the former ambassador to Germany, the one who also decided we need the crusade to decriminalize homosexuality worldwide. But his his proposal actually was exchanging strips of land along the border, where the strip of land that's mostly Serbs would go to Serbia, and the strip of land of mostly Albanians in Serbia would go to Kosovo. So it was by no means like what I would like the most fervent of Serbian nationalists, or even your
Yeah,
average Serb would want in terms of retaking their heartland. But I mean, it would have been something that at least stabilized the situation for the next 5 to 10 years before they had to worry about it again. So
yeah.
like I said, I think it ultimately might not be better that they didn't take the deal because again, it could be seen as acquiescence in a certain way. But at the end of the day, it shows that there seems to be potential for at least some degree of change in that part of the world, which we haven't seen again since the American bombings of the 1990s put the end to the conflicts there.
Right, and I think also there's been a change that's been developing the last 6 years. We're seeing maybe it's an illusion. Maybe in the next 10 years, everything I'm saying will be contradicted. But there's an ossification that's happening of the U.S. and this weakening, this gradual weakening of power, um, is has emboldened some countries to wait it out. We're seeing a kind of division in the United States, and a lot of people are basically bargaining that the United States is actually not going to be capable of unifying um, in such a way that they could after the first Civil War, after the '60s. The demographic is just simply not there. It's not going to be possible, and that some of these trials and tribulations that America is going through are going to be visited upon for basically the same reasons elsewhere in the West. And there's a waiting game that's happening. You could even argue that the clearest example of all of this is Turkey itself.
Oh
Um,
yeah, and you stifle one transition for another great one, but I do have to go with my original one. I was going to bring up that Atlantic article I sent you about Trump's alleged comments during the 100th anniversary of World War
yes,
One ceremonies, and I figured
you read it. That was brilliant.
no more appropriate place to discuss this than after Serbia, of course, because
Yes.
I'm sure you can make the connection, all of you out there. But oh boy, I'm gonna get in some hot water for this episode. This is like the third or fourth one controversial statement I've made, but and that's controversial by our standards. God forbid the general public see this, but uh, with that out of the way, it was in 2018, November 2018, when Trump traveled to France for uh, the ceremonies for the end of World War One, the Remembrance Day ceremonies, and he was criticized for not going to the one because his helicopter couldn't get through the rain. Well, according to four anonymous figures with him, now this is all according to some piece from the Atlantic that came out today by I don't know. There was some very journalistic name. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, who wrote this? I think I think it was like a Goldberg or something. But again, that out of the way, they said that Trump apparently said he apparently brought into question the entire reason, like, well, why were we fighting here? Who were the good guys in this war? Which I could see Trump in his mannerisms saying that. And of course, the comments about John McCain, why are we flying the flag at half staff for him? And but again, that's less related to the topic at hand. But apparently, he was like very cynical about the whole World War One memorials, painting them as this like great triumph over some evil, when again his question was like, okay, why were we here? Who were the good guys? It seems like the guys who were forced to fight this war were kind of suckers. Well, pretty much I would say the way I read it, which isn't the way they wrote it, is he was sort of expressing sympathy for the fact that, wow, a lot of young men who had a lot going for them were sent off to Europe to die for no reason.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of people would agree with. Of course, That doesn't have the kind of narrative continuity about what's the role and purpose of America for, let's say, very journo names and other elites. And so Germany has always been bad, always. So it's not just World War II. Germany was definitely bad World War One. Germany was Holy Roman Empire, also bad. Uh, so
Insert
it'll
Voltaire
be like,
quote.
so it'll be a kind of a demon. There has to be a kind of a demonization of Germany, and basically as a country that's beyond redemption, unless it's a lackey that is under American power and is, paying its dues and listening to what it's being told and so on. Then we can have, as long as it doesn't talk, it can have
Yeah.
something vaguely like redemption. And
Yeah, it can govern. It can like loan shark all the Eastern European countries. It can do what it wants with Greece and
yes,
its debt, so long as they behave themselves. Which again,
right.
Nord Stream 2 is not behaving itself. You're seeing how this all ties together now.
Yeah. So that's basically, the narrative that they have to run on indefinitely. We don't know how long this narrative will go on.
Yeah, and right now, actually, it must have been a Goldberg because I just saw on Twitter, Michelle Goldberg tweeted out that article. I think it is that so a liberal woman journalist, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, of course, putting that out there. Um, but it is an interesting article to read through how much they sweat about the fact that because okay, we've explained this before, the world wars and as you said they're taking back even further. It is the foundational myth of the modern United States, especially World War II, but World War One is pretty close. And criticizing World War One, it's dangerous waters but acceptable. Like if Trump would have said this about World War Two, he would have been impeached tomorrow. I can guarantee you that. But
Oh yeah.
um, he can get away with allegedly making those comments about World War One, which is why it may not have come out until later. Which I believe that something akin to these comments were probably made. It was probably just exaggerated by disgruntled staffers and people in the administration that, again, probably weren't too fond of Trump saying, oh, he said all these horrible things, where, like, again, in reality, he probably said, in, probably in a less intelligent way than this, wow, I can't believe we sacrificed 100,000 men for a few miles of dirt in, the trenches or whatever.
And it's also there basically to echo the point that they've been making for quite some time during all these impeachment processes, and that is he's really a Putin puppet. He's really here to drag America down to the ground and remove, destroy our relationships with our allies. And of course, he would make a statement like this. It's so unpatriotic. He's anti-NATO. It's just there to bolster that other narrative, which was created almost immediately after he was sworn into office. Um, that's all it's there for. It's another left boomer meme. It's there for them to get outraged. These people are never really patriotic. They don't like the army, anyways, or the military rather, unless unless siding with McCain is a way of criticizing Trump.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, you only have to go back to the 2008 election to hear what they said about McCain. All the how he was the next Hitler, he was going to get us into World War III. Which again, I think him being the next Hitler and him getting us into World War III is much more likely. Probably not entirely likely, but much more likely than somebody like a Trump or Romney.
Yeah, I mean that's what liberals and Democrats always say, right?
Yeah, I
Like
mean, it's
every Republican is Hitler, and all of them are going to drag us into World War III.
yeah, and then
I mean,
the Republican previously, whether he was president or not, is always we would just love to have Bush back. We would just love to have McCain back. We'd just love to have Reagan back, and so on, so indefinitely. The only one they don't do that with is Nixon for obvious reasons,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
probably the only Republican president I would take back at this point. But that's a topic for a different show. So speaking of World War One, you want to talk about another former Central Power?
I'm not sure which one you mean.
Uh, let's just say this one has been practicing some neo-blankism. Some may say.
Honestly, I don't.
Turkey.
You mean oh, oh? I thought you said Central European power.
Oh, I, I
I
just
misheard you.
I said Central Power, like Central Powers.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, 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 yeah,
I
no
I
problem.
misheard you.
Yeah, it's okay. You know what? It's not the worst flub we've had on the show, and I'll only dock your pay a little bit for this.
Yeah, so Turkey is really making the rounds. Last show we talked about how Egypt has basically stood up to Turkey in Libya, and all progress that the GNA might have been making towards the city of Sirte has stopped, and so it's a bit of a stalemate now. Turkey is still flying over more, essentially, you know, Syrian jihadists, basically. Many of them who are leaving Idlib to go fight in Libya. Um, but at the same time, uh, Erdogan has sent one of his ministers to Venezuela. This was particularly shocking. Like I thought, of all the places I thought maybe that Turkey would send a minister, probably the last one I would have thought would be Venezuela. Now, this comes on the heels of Maduro setting about 100 prisoners free. These are mostly political prisoners. However, there was one anti-Maduro figure who was accused of stealing millions from the government, and he was assassinated. So in broad daylight in his car. But why would Turkey go there? I mean, are they planning some great, oil trade? I don't think so. Uh, in a way, I think Turkey is already overextended, and I think that this move is really basically to anger America. It's asking America basically for help in Libya. That's my takeaway.
You could say, in many ways, as simplistic a reduction it is, it's a small child lashing out for attention.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, they've
it's
been given a free hand. They've been given a free hand in Syria, uh, which has put America in a contradictory position. Although, yes, I mean, there's a difference between the PKK and the what is it, the YPG?
it's the SDF
Um,
now since 2016.
oh, is it?
Or
Okay,
2000, no, I
so
think 2017 because they rebranded under Trump to not be a terrorist organization.
right, so yeah, I mean, the PKK is considered a terrorist group both by Turkey and by America. However, both of those countries know very well that the Kurds in Syria routinely cross over and mesh with those in the PKK in Turkey. So, in a way, America had to give free rein to Turkey in Syria, partly because they felt it would counteract and just spoil the situation for Russia and for Syria. So, um, I kind of see Turkey's ambitions in the Mediterranean with regards to oil fields under the sea and Libya. Um, these are new developments that they're investing in. They seem to be investing in quite a lot, and this is basically to like a spoiled child or a slap. They're slapping America, as it were, symbolically, in order to gain help from America, especially vis-a-vis Greece. They're in contradiction with over these Mediterranean oil fields.
Yeah, that all relates back to the Greece and Cyprus conflict, and Again, taking about the energy, that's the main news they've made lately, aside from their excursions in Libya, which we'll get into towards the end of the show. But it is an interesting position where you have Trump, who has tolerated their moves in Syria, who has tolerated their moves in Libya, and in Syria at the expense of the Kurds. Trump did betray the Kurds, but I mean, who cares? um, yeah, it's he's willing to let the Turks have a free hand in Syria to loosely enforce American interests at the expense of our Kurdish allies, which again, that goes back to the Biden dynamic, where his main investment in Syria would be that free, independent Kurdish zone under the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're called. Look, there's some Arabs in there, there's some non-Kurds in there. It's not a Kurdish organization. What do you want about? They're not ethno-nationalists. They're
Yeah, yeah,
Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. I don't know what you're talking about, but again, that's the approach there, which is also contradictory with someone like Biden, who would take a very hawkish line against Russia, um, antagonizing Turkey like that, which again is sort of the linchpin in that strategy, I would say, and perhaps maybe
yeah.
that's why there would be so much focus on the Balkans and Eastern Europe. But again, even if you had both of those, Turkey is still an invaluable cog in that machine if you're trying to rebuild that anti-Russia coalition that existed in the time of the Cold War. But with that out of the way, like I said, and this follows some vague Iranian threats about providing the Venezuelans with Iranian-made missiles, which again, that
Yes.
I'm not sure how much of media hype that was or how much of bluster that was because that died out rather quickly. I didn't even see like even the most like hardcore of neoconservatives pick up on it and go on their, of course, usual rant about the new axis of evil. George Bush was right. Blah 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 blah. But it is interesting watching Turkey's moves to the point where I mean I don't know how many more limits they can push, and this will lead into our next topic pretty well. But you had Macron issue a threat to Turkey that said something that Turkey better fall in line, or else it'll have to deal with the wrath of Greece and Russia. Now, it's paraphrasing, but pretty much he said, uh, I mean, this new interesting development, uh, this new interesting rivalry is developing against the two would-be emperors of the world right now. I mean, you have Macron, who views himself as Napoleon when he's more accurately a Napoleon III, and even down to his individual actions. I mean, look, you had Napoleon III. He was going to establish a Habsburg monarchy in Mexico. He was going to fight the Russians in Crimea, which, unfortunately, he kind of succeeded with that one. He was going to destroy any ambitions of a unified Germany. That was Napoleon III. He went on all these different expeditions, most of which blew up in his face, and just trying to claim the legacy of his uncle. And it seems like you have Macron really trying to make France great again by sort of aping that. And, time will
Yeah.
tell how successful that will be, but it is interesting watching him dart to Turkey, dart to Lebanon, dart to Libya, talk about Russia and Belarus and the European Union. I mean, the man is on a world tour, and lately you'd think he was the president of Lebanon rather than the president of France. And we will get into that right now because he has spent how long there now?
I've lost track. It must be 2 weeks now, at least.
Yeah, and that is also on top of his recent visit to Iraq. But it's been interesting watching his sort of play both sides strategy because he goes there, he talks a tough game on Hezbollah, which of course pleases Israel and the Zionist
Yeah.
lobby in France, pleases a lot of the more hardliner Lebanese Christians, the one who were part of that right wing militia during the Civil War. Can't remember what it's called, but I think you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But he also plays coy, saying, "Well, Hezbollah is a legitimate political organization, and tries to appease them and treat them like a legitimate entity when it's convenient." He's really just bouncing off both sides, seeing, I would say, which he can play to his greater benefit. Or again, as we discussed, there always is a benefit in having the division to where it is internally weak and it's easier to exert your influence on the outside. So, I mean, yeah, obviously I would see Israel wanting Hezbollah destroyed. I would see the United States wanting Hezbollah destroyed. But I could see France allowing Hezbollah to exist so long as it allows to leverage the other factions in Lebanon and vice versa. so they can play the internal politics of the country and play a more dominant role in it. Which, again, with Macron's universe-sized ambitions, that seems like the direction he's going. How successful that will be, time will tell. But one of the more interesting things why I bring up Hezbollah is because apparently at a dinner with all these different political leaders, one of the MPs that was part of Hezbollah stormed out because they served wine.
Yeah, he has mentioned that talks of de-arming Hezbollah are at least 3 months away. He also got into an argument with a journal that basically, in his question, more or less let out what was the nature of some private conversations. He blew into a rage over that. The journalist's name was not very Lebanese. I almost wonder if this was staged or not. I don't know. Uh, you know, I feel like a joke, a meme coming on. This is Macron acting out because of the Israelis stopping him from entering the Church of Saint Anne. And
Right, no, that was when his security forces followed them in without his explicit permission, and that was caught on a hot mic. Still, probably one of the best Macron moments out there.
It was a great moment, but yeah, I see your point. Why he might want him there for his own leverage. Um, but as far as Hezbollah, I think Hezbollah has too much popular support in Lebanon to demilitarize them. They're not going to demilitarize them. And more importantly, Hezbollah is inextricably linked to Iran. They depend on Iran, and they depend on the Shia community worldwide. And the idea of them, losing their fangs because of some sweetheart deal in Lebanon, which they're never going to get, um, is not going to work. Primarily
Especially if
because
Macron wants to keep playing coy with Iran, keeping the deal alive, which, again, it's alive in a very skeleton form, but the European Union, especially the French, have been very dedicated to that. I doubt he'd look to
yes. I
antagonize
mean, I
Iran in
know
such a
his
direct way, but continue, continue.
right. Yeah, that is his strategy. Of course, his strategy is a Franco-European strategy. It's there to make some concessions to the Israelis and to the Americans, but he's really working on something that benefits France and Europe and Western Europe in general, particularly with probably his relationship with Germany. I think they see eye to eye on this. Uh, but I think he probably understands, unless he's foolish, that the Iranians do not see any hope of that deal, uh, and they don't see enough independence in Europe from America in order to make that deal again. Again, and I keep saying that word again. None of this has a remote chance. The best possible outcome is if Biden is elected, the deal could be back on the table. And his deal, he's not going to have a deal with Hezbollah until the deal with Iran is solidified, and that's either 4 years away, 5 years away, or it's probably at least a year away if it happens.
Yeah, ultimately, this all boils down to him wanting to, again, do the Napoleon III thing where he is an active player on the world stage. He is relevant. He is important. And also, I think so much focus on the foreign front must have to do with his middling to low internal popularity to the point where, again, if he can score some foreign policy victories, if he can show France is a real player on the world stage that can resolve conflicts and crises, maybe he can garner some support of the French as a beacon of stability, as it were. Similar to, again, Trump trying solve all these various different diplomatic conflicts throughout his time in office. It I would say it's probably along those lines, or maybe he is the Machiavellian genius we've all joked about him being, and really does have a long game in terms of rebuilding the French Empire, starting in Lebanon. And of course, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, he
Out of
has mentioned that if there isn't going to be a deal unless Hezbollah does this. And by that, I think he probably knows by doing that, he's fanning the flames of a civil war. of a potential civil war. He does want to isolate Hezbollah. He wants to put pressures on it, and who knows? In a few months, we may see him, making some gestures towards Catholicism in order to do that, and in order to, because he did, for instance, there's a Syrian Orthodox Lebanese woman who he gave the French Medal of Honor to. She's very well known in Lebanon and with the Lebanese and wider Arabic Christian community in France. So he's already making those kinds of gestures. But again, we're going to have to wait and see, because Hezbollah understands geopolitics very well.
Yeah, and I don't know. Maybe Macron. I did discuss this with you. I think it was in our Telegram chat. Maybe Macron will go full Mussolini and declare himself the defender of Islam, and really try to approach things from that angle.
Why not?
I mean,
Yes.
and of course, this is all on top of Israeli bombings of Hezbollah positions, not in Syria, but in Lebanon proper.
Yes, so they're trying to lure Hezbollah into a fight. I think probably a lot of our listeners know about the story of the 5 Merkava tanks that were left unattended. Like, obviously, this is a stupid ploy.
Yeah. The one
To get
time,
them.
yeah, the one time Hezbollah has a substantial attack against Israel, they don't cry about it to the international community. They say, "Ha, we fooled you." Actually,
Yeah. And then they had some dummy set up like that was supposed to fool them. It was really quite pathetic, but Israeli news was all over it, and they're going, "What the hell is going on with our troops? Why are they leaving these tanks unattended?" It's like, you idiots, don't you know? Don't you know it's a trap? Like, so anyhow, I found that funny. Yeah, there were bombings, and there's some factional fighting. Uh, Nothing that I would say points to a kind of a civil war that we saw in the 70s and 80s, but yeah, yeah. But I don't see it happening just yet. We'll see how cynical the West is. The West would be very happy. I think they can wait this out. They can starve the population. They can turn Lebanon itself into this enormous refugee camp. It already has over 1 million Syrian refugees. It's just, it's so pathetic. I can't tell you sometimes the the amount of anger I have towards them.
yeah, and like I said, this all goes back to the Israeli race against time, as it were, where they're making a lot of
Yeah.
drastic actions, particularly in the West Bank, particularly with the Golan Heights last year, with the time Trump has left in office, because they are unsure or maybe even doubtful about his future
Yes.
prospects of being
Yes.
reelected. And I do think they're also playing this same sort of game while France's attention is on the region, seems to be more, I would say at least slightly anti-Hezbollah. They're willing to capitalize on that now to hopefully get the support of, again, these outside powers while the opportunity is there. So, like I said, I wouldn't say Israel's looking for an all-out conflict, but again, if they can drop a few bombs and talk about the threat of Hezbollah and get France to pressure for a disarmament, or the United States pressure for a disarmament, even if it isn't successful, the fact that they can get them to do that still, I would say, again, affirms that Israel still has influence over a lot of Western countries and can still, to a degree, exercise its will and try to further its goals.
Right, and we shouldn't forget that the main reason why Hezbollah became so popular and so strong. I mean, there are even Christians in Syria who are in Hezbollah. And Hezbollah does not desecrate, for instance, Christian sites in Syria when they're battling them. They actually honor them. Um, but let's not forget that Hezbollah's rise to power and credibility in Lebanon was based on the fact that they went out there and they fed and supplied people with water. Uh, and this was after nearly 2 decades of civil war. So, that's what they came out of. Like they were born in this. So if the West wants to go to a situation like the 70s or 80s, this is not something that Hezbollah is unfamiliar with.
Yeah, that's pretty. I would say that's pretty accurate description of that. Now, with that, I think we should move on to Syria, which there was a little bit of news out of Syria, not too much. The main one, of course, is U.S. and Russian forces are trading blows again in a very 2018 fashion, as you recall, at the beginning of 2018. Of course, more actions in Idlib, slightly less, but Russian planes actually over Deir ez-Zor. It seems like they are now taking concern in the ISIS resurgence there. And I don't think they were
Hmm.
targeting the Nomad uprising. At least I hope not, because I mean that's my new team in Syria. The step aside Assad. It's the age of the Nomad. But of course, there were also U.S. planes off the eastern Mediterranean, uh, where conducting the same sort of drills they always do. Apparently, mock bombing runs a few weeks back. So you had that. You actually had some Syrian casualties, as you can see on the map, up in the Kurdish or SDF controlled zones. Now, that's right on the border with the Turkish controlled zones, and I can't remember exactly whether that was actually clash with Turkish backed forces, Turkish forces proper, or actual Syrian versus SDF forces. And really, well, again, the main news out of Syria will lead into our next topic, which is Libya. The fact that Turkey is evacuating its fighters and putting them in a much more favorable battlefield that they actually still have a chance of gaining something out of.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the coordination between Russia and Turkey with the M4 highway in southern Idlib is continuing. I mean, yeah, it's fraught with all kinds of challenges. It's still way behind. The whole point of Idlib is to turn Idlib into a demilitarized zone. But they're just basically at the moment preparing really to survive more ID attacks. But patrols for the entire length of the highway have been done. That is progress in the considering the last 6 months, which that hadn't happened. And they're also coordinating drills in preparation for attacks. Uh, a lot of these forces inside, it's one jihadi group against another. They're still fighting one another. For for prominence and for just all out survival. Uh, Most of the arguments are about how essentially how much they're going to integrate themselves both in the black market and in the the white market, if you will, of Greater Syria. Um, yeah, there's been some attacks, of course, again in southern Damascus and in the region of southern Damascus, and as you mentioned in Homs with Israeli jets. Two casualties. There's been unconfirmed reports of uh, anti-air defense systems being blown out, three or four, but there's nothing on the ground suggesting that.
Yeah,
Not that
we
I've
hear that
seen
every
so
time
far.
Israel has a strike. Every time they strike, they destroy
Yeah,
half of Syria's air defenses. That was a very
right.
popular meme in 2018. Literally, when they would do it on a weekly basis, like wow, the rate at which they replenish their air defenses is remarkable.
What? Wait, why isn't Assad gone if they're doing all of this?
Uh,
So,
Dastardly Russians, who are also a paper tiger. 2018
yeah,
was a wild time. There was no better time to start the show than that year. I had to say that.
yeah, I agree. It was everything was heating up, and so their attacks in Alms basically is there to thwart the Iranian influence. So Iran actually has, much to my surprise, has some armed drones and non-armed drones flying about there. So Iran's presence, again, compared to 2018, which was quite small, and then for a time they kind of evacuated out of there, and now they've resurged and they're back in there. I think they realize that maybe either victory is at hand or victory better be made soon. It's going to be one of those two, and I'm sure their intelligence, is saying probably both things.
The similar. again, race against time narrative that exists both
Yeah.
in Israel and with the Russian forces in Syria, where they are really banking on a swift victory so they can put the conflict behind them, show it as a record of their success, and not have to deal with the discontent of their population that this conflict they promised would be over 3 months ago, or again, however long,
Hmm.
is still ongoing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Yeah, because I mean, America still has that huge patch on the sorry, on the border of Iraq and Syria, and that's actually where the Israeli attacks originated from. The attacks in the south, of course, came from the Golan Heights. Thanks, Trump. Um,
I bet it was worth the village with your name on it.
so yeah, I mean, I've always said this. You know, America can wait this out, but it seems indefinitely. They'll just print more money. So I don't know. I really don't know. I'm praying that there is a resolution soon.
Seems like recently when we cover Syria in the news, and just the last thing I want to say about it, there's been a lot of false starts, a lot of things that heat up that look like they're going to lead into another revival of the conflict on a large scale, and then they dissipate. It again, I think it goes back to the idea that neither side wants to be the one that fires the first shot, and but they want to be over. And again, it's a case like the phony war where they're at war, but they're waiting for the other side to make a move so they can make their move. Everyone's afraid to take the initiative, and I would say for pretty good reason, at least in this case. But yeah, until one side either slips up or is confident, or more appropriately, overconfident enough to think that they can make their swift, victorious move, it's going to stay like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think with regards to Idlib, I think there's a slow solidification process that's going on there. I do. I think one of the reasons why there's probably been hesitancy about developing that conflict further, the way we saw it in February of this year, is because essentially you're not seeing a lot of attacks originating out of Idlib into Syria. Most of the attacks are occurring in the Homs region, around Palmyra, on the southwestern side of the Euphrates. That's the hot spot, and that's been the hot spot since basically late April, early May.
Yeah, around the certain time when certain events used to happen in Syria, but they dropped that after they realized that act didn't work anymore. But yeah, with that out of the way, we will move on from the Syria slow burn, which that's what it seems to be like, and it seems that it's a new strategy, to Libya. And again, the main news out of Libya is the Turkish moves in Libya. They have been funneling in, I would say at this rate, probably thousands of fighters, thousands of experienced fighters, to fight on behalf of the GNA forces. Of course, GNA are the blue forces, as you can see on the map with the code, the UN recognized government, quote unquote. And then, as I always say, the LNA, which has received substantial amounts of, I would say, Egyptian support, nothing direct yet, but again, the Egyptian parliament has signaled towards support for intervention. They've sent aid. I mean, they've been sending aid for years, but Egypt actually putting its foot down did quite a bit to halt Turkish and Turkish backed advances in Libya. So we're seeing that's the main developing conflict in Libya. Of course, you have the French and the Russians playing a massive role. You have the Turks playing probably one of the biggest foreign role in this war right now. But it seems like the only challenger between even Russia and France, the only challenger that's really willing to stand up to Turkey in any substantial way, as I said in previous weeks, is Egypt. And it looks like that's actually paying off with the, I would say, a little bit of stagnation in the moving of the front on the GNA side.
Yeah, it's turning into another frozen conflict, to be honest. I'm seeing parallels, like the kind that we saw in Ukraine, where you have this contested area. Yes, there are a certain number of deaths that are So it's never really clear how many deaths. Could be 30 a month. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I hear from people who who've been in Ukraine recently, and the deaths seem much larger, but I don't know how to confirm them. From what I hear in the reports, a week could go by and maybe just one or two people are killed. Kind of like I would say it's no worse than Chicago. Oof. So Libya to me is also looking at the moment like a kind of a frozen conflict, and you could say that Syria too is a bit of a frozen conflict. Like obviously Israel can't stem the tide, like it can't really effectively fight Iran there. Its hands are tied, but it's not, no one tied their hands. It's just they're not capable. You know, they're not going to go in.
Like I said, it eventually goes back to the point where nobody has the will to fire the first shot, and they, uh, again, they want the other side to slip up so they can make their move because nobody wants to shoulder the blame if it all blows up in their face. And that's become, again, a facet of fourth generation warfare I haven't realized up until recently. It's always been very secretive, it's always been very blurred lines kind of fighting, but this has become, at least in my opinion, one of the most defining elements. The point where it creates
Mhm.
these frozen conflicts, creates these cold conflicts where nobody wants to make the first move. Nobody wants to, again, initiate anything. They only want to uh, trip up the enemy by capitalizing on their mistakes. And of course, nobody can make a mistake if nobody's doing anything.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like there's just. I mean, a lot of this is also, about stability and capital and finance. I don't think there's any. None of the publics themselves actually support a massive war.
Oh, of course
That's
not.
something that's something I think you could almost graph. Like I think with Russia, I think Afghanistan and Chechnya were basically the last big wars that they were be willing to fight, and I think for America after Iraq, the stomach isn't there. Uh, Many of these other countries, I think for Iran, for instance, after the Iran-Iraq war. I don't see them wanting to engage in a conflict quite like that. So I don't know. I see this kind of in the last 15 years. I see very few countries actually wanting to engage in the kind of wars they did engage. Let's say up until the 80s, with a few outliers like the U.S. in Iraq.
Yeah. And this isn't unprecedented, I would say. Like, now, of course, fourth generation warfare is unprecedented, but in terms of after a very violent period of time like the 20th century, which saw two world wars and several other conflicts that were spawned from the Cold War, people are reluctant to pull the trigger. This happens
Mhm.
after mass periods of devastation, like I just said. So again, you saw this between the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. Now, Afghanistan being an exception because based on the information the American public had at the time, that was a completely justified war in terms of hunting down Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, etc. But in terms of these preemptive wars, these we must get involved for the greater good or some vague interest, again, like Vietnam, like Iraq, there was, what, a 40-year time gap between those? Yeah, you
Mhm.
go from the 60s to the 2000s, so. I mean, so it may be until the 2060s, 2050s, 2060s, until we see a lot of countries willing to commit to a more aggressive, I would say overtly aggressive foreign policy again. That isn't just these conflicts like Libya, like Syria, like these drone wars Obama fought. So, like I said, it may be some time before we see these things boil over because, again, it boils down to the fact that nobody wants to fire the first shot, and that's probably the most uh, straightforward way I can put this. And with that,
Yeah.
uh, yeah. So that was Libya. Unless you have any news I missed about that.
No, actually, I don't have anything else.
Uh, yeah, I can't think of any other news topics we had this week. We got through those actually a bit faster than I expected, and still a pretty packed show regardless. And
I was just gonna say, come on, guys, it was still a packed show,
yeah,
wasn't
yeah, but this is actually shorter than some of the ones we've done recently. So like I th- I think this is one where we're seeing a lot of things developing rather than a lot of things fleshing out.
Yes, yes, I would say that. Most of the news is basically what's happening. The potential that's building in Belarus and in Russia. I think that's, for me, that was the big takeaway story.
Yeah, and like I said, with Montenegro, it's been less than a week since the elections. We don't know the response to the government yet, and again,
Yeah.
like I said, with Libya and Syria, it's become pretty much the same thing every week, where it's it might happen this week, it might happen next week. Stay tuned. But again, just these
Yeah.
little things that just keep on building up. Just these. Again, it's very incremental. It's very easy to miss if you don't tune in the war report every week.
That's right.
And with me shilling myself on my own show, I think that's probably a good place to end it.
Sounds good.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report.
Thanks, guys.
We'll see you next time, and goodbye.